In today's episode of the Obby series, we're going to be implementing the easy mode functionality. The easy mode can be toggled on or off by clicking this GUI button that we created in the past, and when a player toggles it on, it replaces all the parts which have the damage or death effect on them with a bright green part that the players can walk over and not receive any of those effects from. And they can even toggle it on or off inside of their settings as well. And now, with all that being said, let's go ahead and hop right into Roblox Studio. So the first thing that we want to do is go ahead and actually script clicking on the mode button. In order to do this, we're going to go inside of the starter player, inside of the start player scripts, inside of the controllers folder, inside of the GUIs folder, inside of the top folder. And now that we're inside of here, what we're going to do is we're simply going to go ahead and duplicate the skips module script. And then we're going to rename this to be called mode. Then we'll go ahead and open up that module script. And now before we begin scripting, we of course need to kind of clean this script up a little bit and remove some of the things that we're not going to actually use. The first thing that we're going to remove is actually the replicated storage variable because we don't need that, but we do actually need the GUI controller and the state controller, so we'll keep those, but we don't need the remotes variable. Then we have a couple of variables for our GUI, which we're actually going to delete all of those except for the open button. Now currently, the open button is actually referring to the skip button, but instead of referring to the skip button, we actually want to refer to the mode button that we created. And now that we've updated that variable, we can actually remove these two constants as well. And then inside of the onStart function, we're pretty much going to delete every single thing inside of here, but we are actually going to listen for the player state to be updated. So we're going to kind of keep this little part right here, but we'll clear out everything inside of it. And then the last thing that we're going to do is actually remove all of the functions from inside of here as well, except for the onStart function, of course. So now that we've done all of that, your script should look pretty bare, just like mine. And now what we're going to want to do next is actually go ahead and create two constants. These constants are going to be for the color of the button, because we want to change the background color of the button based on if easy mode is toggled on or off. So we're going to go ahead and create a variable which is going to be called on_color. Of course, this is going to be in all capital letters because it is a constant. And for the value of this, we're going to go ahead and use a color 3 from RGB. And for the on color, I'm going to go with our standard blue, which we're already using for the background color of the button. Then I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste this and rename this variable to be called off color. And for the off color, we're going to go ahead and go with a nice little red, just like that. Now that we've created those two variables, the next thing that we're going to do is actually script the logic for when we click on the open button. Now, technically, this is not an open button, and I almost forgot to rename this, so we should probably rename this variable from open button to maybe just button or maybe even mode button. That might make it a little bit more clear. Anyways, once you're okay with whatever the name is for that specific variable, let's go inside of the onStart function. And then I'm going to go ahead and say mode button dot mouse button one click, connect, create an anonymous function inside of here. Now, anytime this button is actually clicked on, what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to update the easy mode setting. And we can actually easily do that by using the settings controller, which I forgot to create a variable for. So let's go ahead and actually do that. What I'm going to do is just go ahead and copy the state controller. Then I'll rename this to be called settings controller. And then we actually want to go ahead and require the settings controller just like that. Cool. So now we've got the settings controller. Let's return to when we listen for clicking on the mode button. And now what we're going to want to do is we'll go ahead and use the settings controller, and we want to use the toggle setting method. Then all we need to do is pass through the specific setting that we want to toggle as a string, and the setting that we want to toggle is the easy mode setting. So now anytime the mode button is clicked, it'll actually toggle on or off the easy mode, which we have stored as a setting. And now the next thing that we want to do is come down to where we listen for the update state event to be fired, because what we want to do is we want to check if the player's easy mode setting has changed, because every single time the easy mode setting changes, we want to update the background color of the easy mode button to reflect if the setting is enabled or disabled. So inside of here, what we're going to do is create a variable which is going to be called isEasyModeSetting. And with this variable, what we want to do is we want to check if the action, so we'll go ahead and say action, and now by default, it only suggests to us the type property of our action. But if this action is actually a setting action, then it'll have a property which is the setting property. And what we want to do is we want to check if that property is easy mode. So this means that the setting that is being changed or updated is easy mode. Now, because of where we're doing this at, we're not even sure if the action is updating a setting or not. But that's perfectly fine to do exactly what we're doing here, because even if setting is a different setting or it is just nil because it's a completely unrelated action, this won't throw an error or anything. And if this is nil, then it just still will return false, meaning that it is not the easy mode setting. So that's perfectly fine. Then what we're going to do is create an if statement. And now what I normally do is I would say if the action.type equals, and then we would check if it is update setting and then handle it that way. But the thing is though, is that we don't actually even have to do that. all we have to do is we have to check if the easy mode setting variable is actually true. And if it is changing the easy mode setting, then what we want to do is we want to check if the setting is enabled or not. So we're going to create a variable called isEnabled. And to determine if the setting is enabled or not, all we have to do is check the value property of the action. Because if the value is set to true, then that means that the setting is turned on. Or if the value is set to false, then that means that the setting is being turned to false or turned off. Now that we know if it's enabled or not, let's go ahead and actually update the background color 3 of the mode button. So if the setting is enabled, then what color would we want to use? Well, of course, we want to use the on color. Otherwise, if it's being turned off, then we want to use the off color variable just like that. Now, I actually almost completely forgot this one last thing that we need to do. Something else that we need to do is make sure that we set the background color of the button to the value of the setting for when the player joins the game for the very first time. So towards the top of the onStart function, what we're going to do is create a variable called isEnabled. Now, to determine if this is enabled or not, what we should do and what we normally do is actually use the settings config, but we don't really need to. It's not a big deal. So what we can do is use the state controller. Then we want to go ahead and get the player's state. Then we'll go inside of their settings table, and inside of their settings table, we actually want to look for the setting called easy mode. And the value of that will let us know if the setting is actually enabled or not. So now that we know if the setting is enabled or not, let's go ahead and update the background color 3 of the mode button. And what we're going to do is we're going to say if is enabled, then we're going to set it to the on color. Otherwise, we're going to set it to the off color just like that. And now that we've done that, we're actually fully finished with this entire script. It's a very simple and maybe our most simplest script that we've created thus far, only stretching about 30 lines. And with that being said, we can go ahead and exit out of the script because, like I said, we're fully finished with that. Before we go on to the next thing, we can actually test this out if we wanted to, just to see what the functionality looks like. When we hop into our game, depending on what you might have had the setting toggled to, we can see that the background color of the mode button has actually changed. So if I click the button, we can see that that now becomes blue. If I click it again, it now becomes red. So that seems to be working as it should. Let's also check our settings GUI, and we can see in our settings GUI that the easy mode setting actually reflects the same status as the easy mode button. So let's click on the mode button and see if it updates the settings GUI, which it actually does. So that's looking great. Let's then actually click the easy mode button inside of the settings GUI and see if that updates the mode button, which it does as well. So this seems to all be functioning exactly as it should be. Now that we know that all that's working perfectly, we can go ahead and collapse the tops folder and the GUIs folder. And next what we're going to do is actually create another controller. So inside of the controllers folder, let's go ahead and create another module script, which we're going to rename to be called effects controller. Now, with the effects controller, what we're actually going to do is move the effects service from the server side and move it over into a controller on the client side. And then we're going to delete the effects service entirely. So let's go inside of the server script service, inside of the services folder, and open up the effects service. Then let's go ahead and copy all the code inside of here and paste that directly inside of the effects controller. Now that we've done that, let's go ahead and actually delete the effects service. And now that we've deleted that entire module, we can go ahead and collapse the server script service because we're done inside of there, and we're only going to be focusing on the client. Now, you may think it's a little bit odd that we're moving the service over to the client side, but by doing this, it actually pretty much only gives us a couple of different advantages with no downsides. One of the major advantages of this is that because of how players' connections actually work, if the player has a poor connection and they actually touch a death part, because of the player's poor connection, they might not actually die or notice the actual death effect for a couple of milliseconds or maybe a couple of actual seconds because their connection is poor. And that's because we've written the code on the server side. So effectively, the client can touch a kill part, but because of their poor connection, they have to wait for the server to catch up and for their character to actually move and touch that part. Then, once the server recognizes that the player has touched that part, it'll actually then respawn their character or maybe deal some damage to them. But in order for that to happen, that means that the server has to replicate to the client that their character has been respawned or that they've received some damage, which once again, because of the player's poor connection, that could be delayed by a few milliseconds or up to a couple of seconds as well. But now since we've moved it over to the client side, the player will feel and see these effects instantly because there's no more waiting on replication from the server side down to the client side and vice versa. So that's one of the big advantages of moving this over to the client side. And another reason that we're moving it over to the client side is because of how we're going to set up the easy mode parts. Right now, I'm not going to fully explain how we're going to set up the easy mode parts and how it relates to moving it inside of here, because I think it makes a lot more sense to kind of go through this entire scripting process, and then when we're adding the easy mode parts, I can kind of explain it then. Anyways, with all that being said, let's begin cleaning the script up a little bit. And I say a little bit because we're actually not going to have to do too much to really clean it up. Realistically, all we pretty much want to do is remove this player data service variable, so we'll go ahead and delete that, and that's effectively all we really need to do to clean this up. Anyways, the next thing that I want to do is create a variable for the replicated storage. So let's go ahead and do that. And now that we've created a variable for the replicated storage, the next thing I want to do is create a variable for the state controller. So let's go ahead and say state controller, and we'll go ahead and require that. So we'll say script.parent, which will take us to the controllers folder, and then we can go ahead and require the state controller from inside of there. Then I want to create a variable for the settings config, which we can go ahead and require from inside of the replicated storage. So we'll say replicated storage.configs.settings, just like that. And now the next thing that I want to do is actually update the player cooldown variable, because we were using this on the server side to keep track of all the different players' cooldowns. But since we're moving this to the client side, we only have to worry about tracking a single player's cooldown, which is the actual client. So instead of calling this player cooldown, we're going to call this isOnCooldown, and we're going to set that to false by default, because of course the player is not on cooldown by default. The next thing that we're going to do is go inside of the onStart function, and we're actually not going to call the setup parts function. So we can go ahead and delete that and leave onStart blank. Then let's go down a little bit, and we want to go ahead and actually update the setup parts function. And now, rather than calling this setup parts, we're actually going to call this setup part. And we're going to add a parameter to this function, which is going to be called instance, and it's going to be of the instance type. Now, if you're unfamiliar with what an instance is, you could think of pretty much every single object inside of Roblox being an instance at its very core. Pretty much every single object in Roblox extends from the instance type, and then just kind of gets specific properties added to it. So if we were to say instance and then a period, this kind of shows us all of the default properties or events and different things like that that pretty much every single object inside of Roblox has, like a parent, a name, the changed event, the send and added event, class name, and all those other things. But then once it goes from an instance to a part, for example, then the part has a lot of part-specific properties like can collide, anchored, can touch, and a ton of other exclusive properties that are specific to the part type. And the reason that we're using instance as the type of our parameter is because we're just not exactly sure what specific thing is going to be passed to this function. Because basically we're going to iterate through every single thing inside of the workspace for the most part and pass that to this function to set up all of the individual parts. So inside of this function, what we first want to do is make sure that it is an actual part. And we actually already do that inside of here. So what we're going to do is kind of delete this for loop right here. And then we're going to go down towards the bottom and delete one of the end statements. Then we can kind of fix this formatting a little bit. So that's a little bit better. And now we have to update this a little bit as well. So instead of checking if the descendant is a base part, we're going to check if the instance is a base part. And if it is not a base part, then we actually want to say return end. Then we'll go ahead and get its effect, which we actually want to get the instance's effect. And if there is no effect, then we want to return end. Then of course we have to update descendant.touch to be instance.touched. Now, when the part is touched, we do want to check if it is a player touching it, but we also want to create a variable called isLocalPlayer because we want to make sure that it's just ourselves who are actually touching it. And what we're going to say is if the player which has touched it is the local player. So we'll say players.localPlayer, just like that. And then we can update this if statement. So if it is not the local player, then we'll stop the function right there because we only ever want to trigger an effect if our own client touches a part. We don't care if other players touch the part because they're handling it on their own client as well. Then we come down to if the effect is on cooldown or not. And we're going to go ahead and just delete this entire line because instead what we're going to do is we're going to say if is on cooldown and use that variable that we updated earlier. And if the effect is on cooldown, then we want to stop the function right there. But if the player is not on cooldown, then let's go ahead and actually set them to be on cooldown. So we'll update the variable right there and we'll update it inside of this task.delay as well. Rather than setting it to nil though, let's actually go ahead and set it to false. And now the last thing that we need to do inside of here for now is once again updating our usage of descendant and swapping that over to instance just like that. Now that we've updated this function, let's go ahead and actually use it so that you're not too confused by why we made the changes that we made. So going back to our onStart function, what we actually want to do is listen to the descendant added event of the workspace, and this will be fired anytime a descendant has been added to the workspace. And now, the reason that we're listening to the descendant added event is because of how streaming enabled works. I know we've talked about streaming enabled quite a few times during the series, but to quickly summarize it, streaming enabled is something that Roblox has implemented so that when a player is about, let's say, like 5,000 studs away from a part or a model, that model will be removed from the player's workspace and no longer rendered in to free up some memory for the player. Because it really doesn't make sense to load in an asset which is thousands of studs away, especially if the player isn't seeing it or anything like that. So let's say that a player gets really far in our obby and that causes them to de-render the earlier stages. Or let's just say that the player is joining our obby for the first time, and the stages towards the end are very far away, so they're automatically not rendered in when the player joins the game. Of course, as the player makes progress towards it, then they will be rendered in and they will be added to the workspace, and that's why we're listening to the descendant added event. So because we're listening to the descendant added event, what we want to then do is actually connect it to the setup part function that we just updated. So we'll go ahead and say local.setupPart. And now anytime a descendant is added to the workspace, we'll go ahead and actually set that part up if it should be set up, because it's a part and it has an effect and everything else that we do and check inside of there. So now that we're listening for when the descendants are added, we also want to actually loop through all of the descendants which are currently inside of the workspace as well. So we'll go ahead and say for underscore comma descendant in workspace get descendants do. And then we're going to go ahead and call the setup part function on each of those descendants just like that. So now we're actually using the setup part function, which we just updated. And now the next thing that I actually want to do is make one slight change to the use effect function. And where I want to make that change at is if the effect is the kill effect. Because if the effect is the kill effect, currently what we do is use the load character method on the player, which effectively just causes the player to respawn. But the reason that we're actually unable to use this method is because the load character method can actually only be used on the server side and not the client side. So instead of trying to respawn the character, what we're going to do is pretty much what we do for the damage effect. So we're actually going to set the health of the humanoid just down to 0, which will have the exact same effect, causing the player to respawn because their humanoid has effectively died, and that's what a character does whenever their humanoid dies. And since we've done that, we should actually be able to go into the game and test this out just to make sure that our effect service is kind of functioning as it normally would. So I'm going to skip ahead a little bit till where we actually get to one of the damaged parts, and like right here is a kill effect. So let's go ahead and step on it, and when we step on it, we can see that we have actually been killed. And we can see that our deaths are increasing as well at the top right, so that is working as it should be. Let's then come over to the damage effect that we have right here, and we can see that when we step on it, we are receiving damage. So that's all working perfectly, and we know that we have actually been setting up the effects controller as it should be. And again, if we look inside of the server script service, we can see that the effects service does not actually exist. So we know that our implementation of the effects controller has actually been done correctly, and we've effectively just perfectly moved the effects service over to the client side. Okay, now that we've confirmed all that's working and we made all the necessary changes to make it work from the server side over to the client side, let's begin writing some of the logic for our easy mode. So below the setup part function, we're going to go ahead and create another function which is going to be a part of the local table, and we're going to call this create easy part. And it's going to accept a part as the parameter, which is of course going to be of the part type. Now we're actually going to call this function somewhere inside of the setup part function, and effectively every single time this function is called, what we want to do is we pretty much want to clone the part which is passed to this function. Then we want to increase the size of it a tiny bit, and we want to change its color from red to a green. And we want to do a couple of other things to it as well, but that's pretty much the main things that we're actually going to be doing. So let's go ahead and create a variable inside of here called easy part. That's going to be set to the part, but we want to go ahead and clone that part. Now, because the parts that are being passed to this function are parts with specific effects on them, what we want to do is we want to actually remove a specific attribute on this part. So we're going to say easy part, then we'll use the set attribute method, and the attribute that we want to clear from this part is actually the attribute named damage. And to remove an attribute from this part, what we can do is just set the value of that attribute to nil, and that'll remove the attribute from the part. So now we're preventing our easy parts from actually damaging the player, which is definitely what we would want to do. Now that we've removed that attribute, let's go ahead and actually parent this part to the part that we've cloned. So we're going to store this inside of the part that we're cloning. Then we want to go ahead and update the name of this part. So we're going to go ahead and say easyPart.name, and we want to go ahead and name this easy. Then let's go ahead and increase the size of this part by a little bit. And how we're going to do that is we're going to say part.size plus, and then we're going to create a vector3.new, and then we're just simply going to add 0.5 to all the axes just like that. So now it slightly increases the size of the easy part from the original part with the effect. And then let's go ahead and update the color of the part as well. And we're going to go ahead and use a color3.fromRGB, and I'm going to go with a nice bright green just like that. Now, the next thing that we want to do is actually set the transparency and if the part can collide or not. Because if we have easy mode enabled, then we actually want the easy part to be visible to the player, and we would want the part to be collidable as well. So we're going to create a variable called isSettingEnabled, and what we're going to do is use the settings config and use the getSettingValue function. First, we need to pass through the state controller, so we'll say stateController.getState, and then we need to pass through the specific setting that we want to get the value of, which is easy mode. Then let's go ahead and set the transparency of the part. And now if the setting is enabled, then we want the part to be visible. So we'll set the transparency to 0. 0, but if the setting is disabled and easy mode is turned off, then we'll set it to 1 because we do not want the part to be visible. Then we'll go ahead and set the can collide property on this part, and what we're actually going to set it to is setting enabled, because if the setting is enabled, then we would want it to be able to be collided with, but if the setting is disabled, then we don't want it to be collided with. And with that being said, we're actually fully finished with creating this function. Now that we're fully finished with creating this function, let's go ahead and actually use it. And we're going to use it inside of the setup part function, but we actually want to do one thing before we use it. And that is go towards the top of our script, and we're going to create another constant, which is going to actually be the exact same constant as part effects. So let's actually just go ahead and copy and paste this. And now we're going to rename this variable from being called part effects, or the second copy of this variable, to being called easy_immune_effects. And what this table actually is all of the effects the player should be immune to when they have the easy mode enabled. So we want them to be immune to the kill effect, the death effect, and the damage effect. Now, of course, because of how we set up our game, those are actually the only effects that we have in our game. But imagine if you added more effects to your game, and you might want some of those effects to still affect the player, even if they have easy mode enabled. So that's why we're creating a separate table with only the effects which kind of damage the player that we want to mitigate when the easy mode is enabled and make the player immune to those specific effects. Now that we've created that variable, let's go back down to the setup part function and use that inside of here, as well as actually using the create easy part function as well. So below where we create the variable for isEffect and we use our if statement, what we want to do is create a variable to check if the effect of this part is one that the player should be immune to. Because if it's a different effect that the player should not be immune to, then we don't need to create an easy part for that specific part because it doesn't have an effect that we care about for the easy mode. So we're going to create a variable called isEasyImmune part. And what we're going to do is we're going to say table.find, and what we want to do is we want to check if that specific effect can be found inside of the easy immune effects table. So we'll go ahead and say comma, then we'll say effect, and now we'll be searching if that effect actually is inside of the easy immune effects table. And now there's actually one more thing that we want to check for before creating our easy part, and that is if the specific part is a net. Because if the specific part is a net, then we don't actually want to create an easy part for our nets. Because if the player has the easy mode enabled, we still want them to die anytime they touch a net part. So we're going to create a variable called isNet, and to determine if it is a net or not, what we're going to do is we're going to say instance, and then we're going to use the find first ancestor method on this, which you can kind of think as find first parent. But basically, it'll look through all of the parents of the specific part and try to find one with a specific name. And the name that we want to look for is nets, because we store all of our net parts inside of a folder called nets. So the part is a net if it has an ancestor, which is called nets. Then we'll use an if statement and we'll say if easy immune part not is net. So if it is not a net, then what we want to do is we want to go ahead and create an easy part for that specific part. So we'll go ahead and pass through the specific instance just like that. And now we're actually creating our easy parts. Now the next thing that we want to do is actually create another function, and this function is going to be used for toggling the easy mode on and off. Because when we do that, we want to change the transparency and the can collide property of the easy parts that are currently in our game. So below the create easy part function, we're going to go ahead and create another function, which again is going to be a part of the local table, and we're going to call this update easy parts, and it's not going to have any parameters. Now, anytime this function is called, what we want to do is we want to check if the easy mode is enabled. So we're going to create a variable called isSettingEnabled, just like we did above, and we're literally going to set it to the exact same value that we set it to in our create easy part function as well. So we're going to use the settings config, we'll use the getSettingValue function, we'll pass through the player state, and then we'll check if the easy mode setting is actually enabled. Then what we want to do is iterate through all of the descendants inside of the workspace. So we're going to say descendant in workspace get descendants do. And now if the descendant's name is easy, then we know that we're working with an easy part. So what we want to do is update the transparency and the can collide property of it. And we can literally just go ahead and copy and paste this from our create easy part function, just like that. Of course, we have to modify this right here. So instead of saying easy part, we would say descendant and descendant, just like that. So now anytime the update easy parts function is called, it'll update the transparency and can collide property of all of the easy parts inside of the workspace. And with that being said, let's go ahead and actually use the update easy parts function, and we're going to use that inside of our onStart function. Now, when do we want to use that? Well, we actually want to use that whenever the player changes their easy part setting. So what we're going to do is we're going to use the state controller. We'll listen to the update state event. We'll go ahead and connect to that. We'll create an anonymous function. The only argument that we actually care about is the action, which of course is of the state controller.update state action type. Then we'll go ahead and create a variable called isSetting. And what we want to do is check if the type of the action is actually updating the setting or not. So we'll check if it's update setting, and we'll also check if the setting that's being updated is easy mode. So we'll say action.setting equals easy space mode. And now if it is setting and the easy mode is the specific setting which is being toggled, then we'll go ahead and call update easy parts just like that. So now every time the player toggles on or off that specific setting, the easy mode setting will go ahead and make the changes to the easy parts that should be made. Now that we're finished this, we are pretty much fully finished with implementing the system, but I almost forgot to do one more thing. And the last thing that we actually have to do is update one more thing inside of the setAppart function. And that's a little bit more towards the bottom inside of the touched event. And now before the cooldown, what we want to do is we want to check if the player has easy mode enabled. Because if the player has easy mode enabled and this specific part is a damage part, then we want to go ahead and not damage the player. So let's go ahead and create a variable called state. And we'll go ahead and use the state controller to get the player's state. Then what we want to do is check if the player has the easy mode enabled. So we'll say is easy mode enabled. And to check if it's enabled, we'll of course use the settings config.get setting value, of course passing through the player's state, and then we'll also check for the easy mode setting. Now we're going to go ahead and create an if statement. And the first thing that we want to check is if this part is an easy immune part. So we'll go ahead and say if is easy immune part, and if it is an immune part, we also want to check if easy mode is enabled. So we'll say is easy mode enabled. And if both of those are true, we also want to make sure that this part is not a net part, because if it is a net part, we still want the net to affect the player. So then we'll say and not is net. We'll return end. So what we're doing is we're making sure that this is an easy immune part. And if it is an easy immune part and the player has the easy mode enabled, then we're not going to damage them. But on top of that, we also want to make sure that this part is not a net, because if it is a net, then we do want the net parts to actually damage the player. So if it is a net, then it'll just continue through here and actually use that effect. Or even if it is an easy immune part, as long as the easy mode is not enabled, then it'll continue and actually use the effect. And now with that being said, we are fully finished with implementing the system, so we can go ahead and test this out. So let's go ahead and do that. We'll go into our game, start this up, and see what happens. Now, once we get into our game, my easy mode is enabled by default, and we can actually see that this damage part that was in front of me is no longer red and is now green. So when I jump on it, we can actually see that we're no longer taking any damage. And if we look behind us, we also have some kill parts that were here as well. But we no longer see those red parts because they've kind of been overlapped with the green part. Now let's go ahead and touch those parts, and when we touch them and walk over them, we can see that we are no longer being damaged or anything. But now if we jump off the map and we touch a net, we can see that we have actually been reset. So the nets are still working perfectly, and we're not taking damage, and we're not getting killed by any of our parts which have those effects on them. Then let's go ahead and toggle off easy mode, and as soon as we toggle it off, we can see a bunch of different parts actually change. So it's kind of cool to zoom out a little bit and then toggle it on or off and see so many different parts changing. But if we leave it off, let's go ahead and try to take some damage. And when we go ahead and step on the damage part, we are receiving damage, so that's working good. Then let's go ahead and touch one of these kill parts, and when we touch that, we are killed and respawned. So this seems to all be working perfectly. We'll go ahead and turn it on once again. When we turn it on and we walk over these parts, we're not taking any damage. So yeah, this does seem to be working exactly as it should be. Anyways, ladies and gentlemen, with all that being said, that's going to be it for this episode. As always, if you did enjoy, please smash the like button and feel free to go down below and leave a comment letting other people know that it worked. I and everybody else really appreciates that. And of course, if you want to gain access to all the scripts, the game file that we made during this episode, and a ton of other resources that you can easily use to make your next Roblox game, there's a link down below in the description to my website, MonzterDev, or my Patreon, which you can support me on both and gain access to all those resources. Anyways, with all that being said, I hope that you guys have a great day, and I'll see you guys in the next episode.